Welcome to Watershed Trees and Poetry. My name is Joe Lamb, and I'm an activist, writer, arborist, working in the urban forest for the last 35 years or so. And I'm also the founder of the Borneo Project, a group that's been working with indigenous peoples in Borneo, helping them secure their land rights for roughly the last 30 years. So I'd like to give a shout out from the land of the grizzly bear to the land of the sun bear, from our watershed in the Berkeley East Bay to the watershed in the Barham River. And I'd like to acknowledge the fact that we are guests on unceded land of the Shoshone-speaking Ohlone people. And we're here on the banks of Strawberry Creek to talk about trees, poetry, watershed, and the porous boundaries of the imagination with Ben Gucciardi, founder of an amazing poet and also the founder of Soccer Without Borders. And Ben will be reading today some of his own poetry as well as other people's poetry. So I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of other members of our community, and in keeping with the philosophy of the great botanist, scientist, indigenous writer Robin Wall Kimmerer, I'd like to say hello to some of the tree people, to the Sequoia sempervirens that are around us here, pointing way up into the sky, growing out of the soil. One of the best ways to meet a tree is to first go up and put your hand on it and to feel your skin against their bark, your flesh against their flesh, and in so doing to recognize the fact that we are distant relatives. This tree and I share 50% of our DNA in common and over 60% of our ancestors in common. I'm Joe Lamb, and here is Ben Gucciardi.
So I wanted to start with a poem by a Bay Area poet who lives in Santa Cruz, Danusha Lemaris. He's a good friend of mine and a beautiful poet. And this is a poem called Stone. And what am I doing here on the side of the hill, at the ragged edge of the tree line, sheltered by conifer and bay, watching the wind lift softly the dry leaves of bamboo? I lie on the ground and let the sun fall across my back, as I've been doing for the past hour, listening to the distant traffic, to the call of birds I cannot name. Once there was so much I thought I needed. Now, all I know is that I want to get closer to it. The rocky slope, the orange petals of nasturtium adorning the fence, the wind's sudden breath. Close enough that I can almost feel at night the slight pressure of the stars against my skin. Isn't this what the mystics meant when they spoke of forsaking the world? Not to turn our backs to it, only to its elaborate plots, its complicated pleasures, in favor of the pine's long shadow, the slow song of the grass. I'm always forgetting and remembering and forgetting. I want to leave something here in the rough dirt, a twig, a small stone, perhaps this poem, a reminder to begin again by listening carefully with the body's rapt attention. Remember, to this. And I want to read another poem. It feels really fitting to read here in front of this tree by Joe Lamb. This is a poem called How Redwoods Tell Time. And this poem starts with an epigraph from Rilke. And the epigraph is, "A tall tree standing in the ear." How Redwoods Tell Time by Joe Lamb. We don't feel the moon as it drifts ever so slightly away, slowing the Earth's rotation a few microseconds every year. But imperceptible changes do build up, even when not perceived. Rocks on the summit of Everest, now under ice, contain shells of clams who lived on the sandy bottom of a warm ocean that at one time covered almost all of the Earth. What was low has indeed been raised high. On the body of land we now call Antarctica, a stream once flowed through a tropical rainforest, a stream inhabited by a tribe of long-necked fish, some of whom wriggled out of the water and propped up on their front fins to better peer through wisps of fog rising among the ferns. Imperceptible hands of time fashioned the bones that once fanned water over gills into little hammers that, whenever we hear a fish splash or the wind moving through redwoods, tap perceptibly against drum skins stretched inside our ears.
We'd like to riff just for a minute about poetry and trees, and about what trees can teach us about poetry and how they're interactive. And in conversations that we've been having about this, we've been kicking this around now for a while. One of the things that we love about what trees do is they do what a friend of mine who's a scholar of beat poetry says Gary Snyder's poetry does, is they give us scalar interruptions. They mess with our kind of anthropocentric view of the universe. We're walking down the street, all looking ahead, not looking down that much, not looking up that much, just seeing things from a very human perspective. And that's also true of our sense of time. And trees, of course, really interrupt our perception of our anthropocentric sense of time that's framed around just one human lifetime. And Ben has had the great honor of wandering in the bristlecone pine forest in California, where there is a tree growing that was breaking seed and the sprouts emerging from the seed 400 years before writing began in Sumer. So one of the things that we really love about trees is how they mess with our sense of time. And maybe Ben would like to read a quite lovely poem that he wrote about that event.
This is an erasure poem that I just, from walking through the bristlecones, just picked up the guide from the nature guide and just did this erasure, and just came out with this little poem that's still a draft, but wanted to read it today. Baked brown seeds swell on a north-facing slope. Lateral roots, sapwood, each year a drier note. Sagebrush, pinon, count the whorls on a branch. Compare dieback, time, gravity, wind-blown ice. It is alive. Polished arrow, thin strips of heart rot. As dead wood decays, it slowly releases viable seeds. Lightning strikes. The impact is not known. And I think, Joe, just one other thing, just as you were talking about the scale and just kind of the interruption of our usual way of thinking about time. And it also brought to mind this quote from Rebecca Solnit, a mutual friend of ours, from her recent book coming out called Orwell's Roses. And I also just wanted to read that because it really echoes what you were saying about scale and time.
I love that quote.
And so this quote, this is from Rebecca Solnit in her new book, Orwell's Roses. There's an Etruscan word, saeculum, that describes the span of time lived by the oldest person present, sometimes calculated to be about 100 years. In a looser sense, the word means the expanse of time during which something is in living memory. Every event has its saeculum, and then its sunset, when the last person who fought in the Spanish Civil War or the last person who saw the last passenger pigeon is gone. To us, trees seemed to offer another kind of saeculum, a longer time scale and deeper continuity, giving shelter to our ephemerality the way a tree might offer literal shelter under its boughs. And Joe, I don't know if you just wanted to talk a little bit more about that concept to you, and sort of how that sort of your relationship to trees, and how that sort of broadening of the saeculum has been a part of your experience in getting to know them so well.
When you look at trees, one of the things that I think that trees do that good poetry does as well is that it connects the unseen to the sky in some senses. Like this tree right here is likely, its roots are likely fused with all of the other trees in this area. In fact, the mass of this tree is probably as great underground as it is above ground. And in ecosystems around the planet, the vast majority of carbon is actually stored in the soil. So there's all this world that's going on underneath us, in some senses almost like the unconscious of the earth. And trees somehow then have this root crown with roots escaping from the root crown out into the soil. And then from that, they're drawing nutrients and moisture, and it's really difficult to imagine how moisture can make it from the ground all the way up into the tops of these giant redwood trees. It's just a stunning act of physics, actually. And I think that poetry does, some similar work, that it works in the realm of the unconscious, and it brings things out of the realm of the unconscious into the realm of the visible. And you have anything to say about scalar interruptions as well?
Joe, I think that some of what you're talking about just makes me think of, there's a poet, Arthur Z, who has a recent book out called The Glass Constellations. And I think something that I love about his work is how he sort of moves between the physical world. He has all these like really beautiful descriptions of the landscape, mostly in the West, and then kind of fuses a lot of the subconscious and brings a lot of these ideas to life. So I wanted to read one of his poems as well. Leafing branches of a backyard plum, branches of water on a dissolving ice sheet, chatter of magpies when you approach. Lilacs lean over the road, weighted with purple blossoms. Then noon sun shimmers the grasses. You ride the surge into summer, smell of pinyon crackling in the fireplace, blued notes of saxophone in the air. Not by the sand running through the hourglass, but by our bodies igniting, passing in the form of vapors from a living body. The world of orange sunlight and wildfire haze, world of iron fillings pulled through magnetic south and north, pool of quicksilver when you bend to tie your shoes. Standing, you well up with glistening eyes. Have you lived with utmost care? Have you articulated emotions like the edges of leaves? Adjusting your breath to the seasonal rhythm of grasses, gazing into a lake on a salt flat and drinking in reflection the Milky Way. And I just love the way that that poem kind of moves from these different layers of the seen and the visible and the concrete into these sort of more subconscious spaces. And I think it just really speaks to what you're talking about in terms of the way, the way that the trees are connecting what we can see and what we can't see.
So one of the great joys of being an arborist is that you get to spend your day working with trees. And this tree right here is a camphor tree, which is a tree that is not native to the Bay Area. It's actually from Southeast Asia. But it's a member of the laurel family. It's in the same family with cinnamon trees. And one of the things that trees teach us is, I think, a very important lesson for the time in which we live. And it's the difference between denial and compartmentalization. And trees, the way they respond to wounds is that they form dams of hardened wood to protect the inner heartwood from rot. And all of these circles, these odd circles around the tree, are actually from the tree forming dams of hardened wood that have protected it. Like those are wounds where the tree had lost branches in the past. And compartmentalization then is a way of, when you're being attacked by something, of containing it, of keeping it from overwhelming you. But trees are incapable of denying the environment. They live in the environment, completely exposed to it at all times. And to me, in the kind of news environment that we're living in these days, we are being constantly bombarded with more information, more horrific information than we can really deal with. And compartmentalization for me is one of the ways that I can preserve my psyche, because I don't want to deny the horror that's taking place on the planet, but nor do I want to let it leak into all of the other aspects of my life to where I become inefficient at just doing the day-to-day work of trying to be a good human being on the planet. So thank you very much, Camphor, for doing that. This tree has great medicinal value in Southeast Asia, where it's used in many different things, in tiger balm and all kinds of camphor-related medicines for healing wounds, and for also if you have muscle strains. The vast majority, lots of medicines that we have, if you go into just a pharmacy, 40% of the medicines that are in pharmacies actually come from plants. They've been derived from plants. And a lot of the medicines that are used for treating heart attacks and cancer actually come from rainforest trees. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
I think, just something that you were saying, Joe, that resonated a lot with me is, I think that's connected so much around the way that the trees are responding to the wounding, and just thinking about the way poems help us as people to also respond to wounding. And I think that's something that I've definitely tried to explore in my own work, and I think is an important aspect of what poetry can do, and of the ways that humans are able to kind of mimic some of that behavior. So I thought I might read a couple poems that are sort of engaging with that theme. And I wanted to start with this poem that's called "Hunting Chanterelles in the Oakland Hills," and it'll definitely have resonance with the things that you were talking about, Joe. Hunting chanterelles in the Oakland Hills. It is not only trauma which cleaves, the soul also fractures in joy. All month I summon the shard of myself, still kneeling in the sword fern, tracing the forked ridges of winter's first chanterelle. But it won't leave the scent, soil pinched with pepper, apricot, to return to the city, where another piece of me mutters under the overpass, looking for a fix. Sometimes when I plead for my fragments to join, I hear my mother's voice calling her dead daughter home. Slow down, my friend insists, off trail in deep woods. They're easy to miss. Rain spills from my cap as I scour the chaparral, bending to buckeye roots, digging through duff. There, flesh worthy of the name, chanterelle, I remove the veil of mud as if it were lace. I splinter when my fingers slip the stem from loam. And I might just read just one more, a little bit around just the response of, just the way that to your point, Joe, around the way that the trees heal. And this is a poem. I have these series of poems in my book West Portal that are written in circles and kind of just mimicking the shape of this year's. The text actually moves in a circle. And this is a poem called "Halo for the Scorched Orchard." In the pause between death and tendril, the farmer kneels where the gage tree grew, knowing she will stay in the pause between death and tendril. So just thank you for that.
So we're standing here in front of Ginkgo biloba, which is a tree that's native to China, but it's what some people call a living fossil. This tree has not changed in the last 260 million years. There are leaf fossils from this tree dating back that far that are identical to the leaves that are here today. And so this tree exemplifies another one of the amazing things that trees teach us, which is the power of survival. This ginkgo, this particular tree, has broke out in the crown. The very top of it was broken out, and from those breakage, then it's produced new shoots that have shot up that will in turn then become the new crown of the tree. There were 6 ginkgos that survived the blast in Hiroshima. They were less than 1.5 miles from the epicenter of the blast in Hiroshima. And even though they were charred, they came back to life, and they've been tended and are still alive today. So thank you, Ginkgo Biloba. And if I live to be 1,000 years old, I still will not know nearly everything about arboriculture. I used to say that there are 60,000 species of trees on the planet, and I only know, very few of those. But I found out recently that new estimations are that there's more like 75,000 species of trees on the planet, and a lot of those have yet to be identified. They live in the rainforests of the Amazon and in the rainforests of Borneo. But even though I've worked on many ginkgos, I have never seen these weird stalactite forms on the tree that this tree has. I don't know why I've never seen that before, but I'm not even sure what they are. I think that they're, probably something like you see on the swamp cedars down in Louisiana, but I don't know what they are. But thank you, Ginkgo.
Joe was talking about a couple of things, the power of survival and shapes, and I wanted to read a poem that speaks to both of those. First, a little bit more about the power of survival. This is one of my poems called Scavengers, and it goes, "Wildfire has scorched 47 acres in the valley below the house where I am staying, and now 3 slow vultures trace black circles through the air, descend, feast, climb, repeat. If no clouds bring relief, let us place our fingers like crimson beaks into the burn of our lives and endure." And the other one I wanted to read, which I think just as Joe was looking at some of these amazing shapes, and you just see this ginkgo and you kind of come across it like you're in a marsh in the Black Forest in Germany, even though we're here on the UC Berkeley campus. It sort of has that feeling of these shapes coming down. But this is a poem from A.R. Ammons called Poetics. "I look for the way things will turn, out spiraling from a center, the shape things will take to come forth in, so that the birch tree, white, touched black at branches, will stand out, wind glittering, totally its apparent self. I look for the forms things want to come as, from what black wells of possibility, how a thing will unfold, not the shape on paper, though that too, but the uninterfering means on paper, not so much looking for the shape as being available to any shape that may be summoning itself through me, from the self not mine, but ours."
So I'm so excited and honored to be here at Watershed, just because I love the idea of watershed itself and thinking about what it means, about what a watershed means. And in thinking about that, I think it's important to realize that a watershed is not just the streams, it's also the way that water moves through the soil to the streams, and it's also the way water moves down through the soil to the aquifer that's underneath us. And it's important to realize that those aquifers are being mined around the planet right now. The Ogallala Aquifer, which is underneath a lot of the Midwest in the United States, is responsible for, a lot of the grain that Americans eat. And right now we are removing, I think I have the number accurately, 18 Colorado rivers worth of water from the Ogallala Aquifer every year. And it's not being replenished. It's being replenished at a very small amount. So when we think about watersheds, we need to think about watersheds in a different kind of scalar sense. We need to think about watersheds as being part of this much larger phenomenon that's going on. And so the water doesn't only move through the soil, and it doesn't only move down into the aquifer, and it doesn't only move through the streams. It also moves through the trees, through the process that Ben was talking about earlier about transpiration. The roots of the trees take up moisture, and then through a, it seems to me almost miraculous process, they somehow are able to get that moisture all the way up into their crowns, where some of the moisture has to be released into the air in order for the tree to draw up more. That's part of the process. It has to release some into the air. So that transpiration process actually changes the world that's around it. In the rainforests of the planet right now, the rainforest transpiration creates rain. In places in the Amazon where deforestation is so extreme, certain places are raining less because there are fewer trees there. And some scientists are predicting that there's an entire very large area in the Amazon that may no longer be rainforest in a few years. It may tip the balance, and it may move away from being a rainforest into being a shrubland. So another thing that we'll be talking about again is how every creature in the environment is shaped by the environment. And every creature in the environment in turn shapes the environment. And that's of course true of human beings. We are shaped by the world that we live in, and we in turn shape the world that we live in, and then the world in turn shapes us again after it's been transformed by us. And the watershed here is in relationship to the watersheds in Borneo, to the watersheds in the Amazon, because another part of the watershed that exists is there is a watershed in the air. We're all knowledgeable, or at least aware of the fact that there are these atmospheric rivers that come from ocean currents, and you get tremendous amounts of rain that are dumped. We have, thank God for the atmospheric river that's helped at least alleviate part of our drought. But it's important to realize that the watershed also includes what's happening in the atmosphere, and that all of that is interconnected on a global scale. I mean, if you want to get really scalar about your interruptions, all of these things are interconnected on a global scale. And so I'm standing in front of a beautiful coast live oak, a native species, and then behind that is a eucalyptus grove, a eucalyptus grove that I think is gorgeous, that was planted, I think, in the 1800s. It's some of the biggest eucalyptus around. And I have a love-hate relationship with eucalyptus. I love the beauty of their form. I love the smell of their leaves. I love having been in the crown of eucalyptus when I was much younger and climbing trees when I was a younger guy. But eucalyptus also symbolize one of the big problems on the planet right now, which is that people are looking for a silver bullet to end climate change, and they've kind of latched on trees as the silver bullet for ending climate change. And as a person who loves trees and who's worked on indigenous rights and forests for 30 some odd years, I can say that it's not that simple. It's much more complicated than that. It's the right tree in the right place. And some places it's the right forest. Most places it's the right forest in the right place. And unfortunately around the planet right now, all over, rainforest is being removed, or in other places, grasslands, which are actually really pretty good at sequestering carbon, are being removed in favor of monoculture plantations of palm trees and of eucalyptus trees and of acacia for pulp. Monoculture plantations are not forests. They do not support the species diversity, the wildlife. That is not the solution to climate change. And so I would like to read a poem that I wrote and dedicate this poem to a friend of mine, Lafcadio Cortese, who just died this last week, very unexpectedly. Lafcadio is a 60-year-old man, and he died without any warning in his sleep. And for much of his life, Lafcadio has worked with indigenous peoples in Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, all around the world, trying to secure land rights for indigenous peoples, which is one of the main ways that we can stop climate change, is by securing land rights for indigenous peoples. So here's a poem that I wrote after Mary Oliver's death called Mary Oliver in the Forest, with thanks to Kobayashi Isa. The dead show little concern for our condolences. Might as well beg forgiveness from the moon, or expect the ocean to thank you when you clear a path in the plastic debris for turtle hatchlings to struggle their way into the waves. And yet, that which lives in memory lives, and that which lives in many memories lives in a forest of neurons, and does not die with the passing of a single tree. Thank you, Lafcadio, for a life well lived.
So I think, yeah, just with Joe talking about the watershed and just some of the different ways, this poem came to mind. I wanted to read this poem here called Spill. And I think it'll sort of speak for itself in terms of the connection to Joe, to just to what you were talking about. So this is a poem called Spill. I follow my father down a corridor of laurel, where I see wild, he sees symmetry. Red trillium refutes winter's theorem. Distant ridges divide place into watershed, basin. I don't understand this mathematics he makes of the world, but I follow close in case he speaks, tasting yarrow, sorrel when he picks it. The trail opens at the tainted river. When the samples are capped, levels tallied in a ledger no one will see, he rolls up the sleeve of my sweater. His finger traces the path of the spill's damage. Or is he reading my palm, naming the crease where the heart line fuses with the head? I know not to ask what might come. Cup my hand as if guarding a damselfly. Another poem that sort of in conversation with that around, I think this one just sort of exploring a little bit more the idea of Joe's talking about some of the ways that we're sort of over exploiting and plundering and the instinct to turn away from some of that. And I just wanted to read this poem about that instinct. It's called The Hermitage at Laurel Dale. Of a life playing Bach for moss on a swollen cello, lying for days in a field of milkmaids, undressing in fog to translate Jeffers, Vol, Etnrafung, Stein, Wahrheit. Only 6 rotted railroad ties remain, and a few microfiche slides of Emil Barth's meticulous cursive filling the page. A buck plus what's foraged feeds you well enough, he wrote in his journal, March 8, 1916. But a boar, salted and cured, is divine. When the poets came to visit, he didn't tell them he was unhappy, nearly always sick. He toasted with plum mead, laughed at stories of their trysts. So what? Touch haunts you, he told himself when they'd gone, drinking from the spring, scrubbing his doubt with clear water. The bombs would fall anyway.
In keeping with the fact that we're playing with the ideas of borders and what borders are real and what borders are imaginary, and who really is part of the self that we think of as being the other, I'd like to say that my career in arboriculture wouldn't have been possible without the guys from Mexico who are climbing around in the trees with me. And so I would like to give a shout out to them as well. I'd like to thank them for their hard work and their valor. And here's a poem that I wrote in their honor years ago called Arboriculture in the Promised Land. Go into the intimacy of your private eternity with the wild patience of a star thistle who reaches out from a crack in the overpass to release her seeds into the gray wind sweeping down the freeway. Open your being into belief in the possible with the earnest abandon of a young mother who kneels at the truck stop in Nogales to pour water into plastic milk bottles before she lifts her baby onto her back and follows the coyote into the tamarisk and tumbleweed that line the river leading to her husband who prunes trees in the promised land of the north. Find a memory of when love has hurt you. Hold that memory with the precise tenderness of an oyster enveloping the sharp edges of pain with a luster as smooth, as hard, and as forgiving as the color of the moon. Okay, here's another tree poem. I don't know if you've ever eaten a durian, but I hope that sometime in your life you have a chance to eat a durian. Hazel, yes, hazel. What was the sun thinking when he talked this tree into making a durian, the spiky queen of stinky fruits? We no longer remember the time when thought, tree, and sun were words that fit together as neatly as dendrites, photosynthesis, and nuclear fusion. Linnaeus said that without knowledge of its name, memory of the thing itself vanishes. But names have only small fingers and can hold only what we let them. I hold on to the name of the first girl I ever kissed, but can no longer remember the color of her eyes. We were 10. Later that year, I learned why her father was never home. 50 years later, I can almost feel her shoulders trembling, can almost feel the sidewalk beneath us vanishing. Thank you. So here's yet another example of how creatures modify the environment that they live in. This camphor tree has produced roots that have become the bank. These would not be the normal roots of this tree if it were just growing out in the soil. But you can see that what's happened is by forming this big mass of roots here, it's stabilized the entire side of the bank and is keeping it from just sloughing down into the stream. And I was recently reading the IPCC report about climate change, and one of the lead authors in the IPCC report was saying that we have no choice as human beings but to change the environment that we're going to be living in. But we do have a choice as to what those changes will be like, whether those changes will benefit humanity or whether those changes will destroy humanity. And I think it's important to think about trees in that regard, and it's really important to think about urban trees in that regard. All of these trees that you see out here on the street are playing a really central role in improving our quality of life, even though we don't know it. In places where there are lots of urban trees, there is lower crime, there was lower ADD in schools in the areas that are surrounded by greenery. If you were in a hospital room that looks out onto leaves, looks out onto trees, you heal faster than you do if you're in a hospital room that doesn't have a view out into nature. Urban street trees really reduce storm runoff. They store more water in the soil so you don't have to spend as much money on infrastructure. Um, there's so much that can be done to alleviate the worst aspects of climate change, and climate change is on its way. As to whether it's horrific or just pretty bad is dependent upon what we do with it, and trees have a very central role in that. I just like to say that it's just been so much fun and such a great honor to be here with the fabulous poet Ben Gucciardi, and also just all of our thoughts as we were like putting this together, just wandering, thinking about trees, and I hope there's a lot more wandering underneath the trees, thinking about them in our future here. I hope that's right. And I want to thank all of the people at Poetry Flash for your beautiful work, and I want to thank Jesse for his great cinematography. It's a real honor to be here.
Yeah, and I think for me it's just so good, Joe, just to see how you walk through the forest and the things that you notice and pick up, and for me to be able to take that away. And I think in a lot of ways we're losing a lot of that knowledge and that understanding and the ability just to look and the ability just to notice. And I think poetry is one of those forces that can kind of bring us back to that and can sort of ask us to look more closely, to slow down, to notice, to invite that kind of understanding that you so embody. And I think that your work as an arborist kind of insists upon that. I think a lot of people don't really have that connection anymore. And I just remember reading recently about the way that language in poetry is starting to change because there are images that people don't understand in terms of or even evoking a night sky, the stars in the night sky. The line from Danusha's poem about feeling so close to the night sky that you can feel the pressure of the stars on you. That is becoming less. It's becoming less accessible for a lot of people as we lose access to some of those things, and I think that the spirit of this festival and Joe, your life's work of dedicating yourself to preserving that way of knowledge, that way of understanding, that way of being, is so important. And I think it's just like you said, it's an honor to be a part of that and to try to preserve some of that way of being in the world and that way of engaging with the watershed, with the trees, with nature, with each other, and with poems. So thank you all so much for spending some time with our words and thoughts, and the words and thoughts of the other poets that we kind of invited into the space and the trees. And I think that's everything.